Chris, Good Roads. In the last video, we made this. This is a super inexpensive, easy to make set of molds for a skateboard. And we're going to continue on with that project today of making a skateboard with very little tooling for very inexpensive. And the next thing that we need in order to be able to make a board is basically a giant clamp. The way skateboard construction works, or at least the way this style, and the most typical style of board construction, which is horizontal lamination, the way it works is that you've got a bunch of sheets and you put glue or resin or something in between them. You clamp them down into the shape that you want and wait for the glue to dry. But because you've got such thin, flexible pieces of wood or whatever other material you're using, and because that surface area is so spread out, we don't want there to be any gaps or anything, you need a lot of clamping force. Now, professional presses are in the many tons of clamping force. Same thing with snowboard presses, and they're using hydraulics or pneumatics in order to create that force. The electric press that I have, that I built last year, is 1.5 tons, and it's very weak, honestly, for the kind of work that we would want to be doing. However, there are plenty of ways that we can get enough force to press a board of this size, a little bit bigger, with pure mechanic leverage. Another advantage we have is, as I mentioned in the previous video, we're going to be pressing sheets of Baltic birch plywood instead of individual veneers, and since that material's got a little bit of internal stiffness to it, we don't have to be as precise with our clamping force. So, the absolute bare minimum cheapest way is to just take the heaviest things that you have and pile them up on top of your mold. But it's inconsistent and it's difficult because even if you have a lot of heavy stuff, which when we do the video on actually pressing the board, I'll show you, I've got some anvils, I've got some tool steel, you could use weights. There was a story one time way back where someone actually just parked their car on top of it, one tire up on top of their mold. And that'll all work pretty well. But we can do something that'll be a little bit more reliable, a little bit more repeatable, and that'll give us more even clamping pressure. And that's what I'm going to show you today. We're going to make some really simple purpose-made clamps that are then very easy to turn into a static mechanical press. And just like when we made the mold, it's going to take very little in the way of materials and in the way of tools. So let's get started. Tea time. Here is an example of the kind of clamp that we're going to make. Construction is super simple. On each side, we've got a carriage bolt, we've got a washer to distribute some force on the top, we've got a nut for tightening, and then we're just using the other end of the carriage bolt for distribution of force on the bottom. And other than that, we've got two spars. In this case, they're going to be made out of a 2x4. We've got one for the bottom, one for the top. And you put your mold inside of these, and when you're ready to press, you squash down and you tighten the nuts. For a board this size, 3 will probably work. 4 would be better. You want a clamp for basically any place where there's an important transition in the geometry of your board. So for a board like this, you have a transition here that's really important, where the kick and the concave meet. You have a transition here, same thing with the nose, and then you've got concave through the middle. Now, you could probably get away with having a clamp here, and a clamp here, but even with simple molds like this, and even with pretty light tonnage press mechanisms like these, the more force you have, the better your curves are going to end up, the better your plies are going to stick together. So for something like this, 4 is going to be fine. If you're getting into wider or longer decks, so you're getting into like 8 or 10 inch wide, you get into the longboard world where you're getting longer and longer decks, I would say at least 5 clamps. And if you're getting into dancers, that length of board 6 is almost certainly the minimum. The good news is, for a set of 4, the hardware and materials that you need for this, less than 20 bucks. And that's why I recommend building these clamps instead of just going out and buying clamps. You can do that and it'll work absolutely fine. It'll be great. But you're going to spend a lot more money on clamps than you would if you just make them yourselves and only buy the hardware. So let's talk about materials and hardware. What you're going to need for each clamp is 2 carriage bolts, 2 nuts that fit the carriage bolts, and 2 washers. That's 2 washers that fit the carriage bolts. So for 4 clamps, you'll need 8 of each of those pieces of hardware. The thickness is something worth paying attention to. These are 3/8, but if you go too narrow on the bolt, you can use them, but they'll wear out really quickly. So if you do like a 1/4 inch bolt or an 1/8 inch bolt, you'll only get a couple uses out of it before the threads wear out. Now, if you're only trying to make one board, you could probably save a little bit of money that way, but it doesn't cost a whole lot more to go up to a 3/8 or 1/2 inch. And if you invest the extra money in it, then you'll have tools that'll last you a lot longer. In addition to the hardware, you need a 2x4. You're gonna need 2 cuts of wood for each clamp. And the way you wanna think about the width of your clamps and these boards, the spars that you're using for the clamps, is you wanna give yourself plenty of room on either side for your mold to fit it. So these clamps here, I think the distance between the rods is 10 inches, which means I could probably press up to a 9.5 inch wide mold would be tight. That would be very close on the tolerances to the bolts on either side. It's nice to have a little bit of wiggle room in case your material overlaps out of the press a little bit, in case everything's not quite lined up right and things are skewed a little bit. So I recommend going a good amount outside of the width of your mold. These look to be, the spars themselves look to be 2 inches wider than the mold. And then you also want to make sure that you have enough material on the outside of the bolts so that they don't bust, so that it doesn't break along the grain and tear out. So make sure that you've got plenty of surface area, make sure you've got plenty of room between your bolts to work. And if you have an idea of the width of your mold and you have an idea of how many clamps you need, somewhere in that 3 to 6 range, then you'll have an idea of how much wood you need to buy. But one of the reasons I think that this is a good place to go if you're on a budget or just starting out is that 2x4s are really inexpensive. The cost of a board foot for a 2x4 is like nothing. So if you get yourself a little bit extra, it gives you some wiggle room in case you make any mistakes. But you can also play it really close and just buy the absolute minimum you need and save some money that way. The next thing we need to talk about is tools, and it does not get a whole lot easier than this as far as tool requirements. But unlike our last build, we do have one power tool requirement. You really can't get around it, and that is a drill. This is really the only place in this whole series that we're going to be needing a power tool. You can do it without this. You can make a skateboard without a powered drill. You can press the board the way I mentioned before without the clamps by just piling heavy stuff up on top of it. And then when it comes to actually drilling the bolt holes for the board, you can use a hand drill. You can you can get creative and figure it out. But that gets to a place, at least for me, where the amount of money that you'd be saving by not using a tool like this is completely overwhelmed by the amount of work that you have to put in. This tool here, having access to a drill, does double duty here and makes it so much easier to drill the bolt holes when it comes time to do that. So I recommend hunting one of these now. You could borrow one from a neighbor. You could get on Craigslist and buy one used, or probably get one for free used if you're in a pretty populated area. Keep an eye on the free section and be patient. You could go to a yard sale. With a little bit of effort, you can spend very little money and get something that does this job. And I gotta say, it's worth it. It's gonna be the only expensive tool that you're gonna have to buy during this process. And if you can borrow one, or if you already have one, you're already off to a good start, but you've gotta recommend a drill for this one. You're going to need a saw of some kind. Now, if, like in the last video, you got the recommended saw for making the mold, which was this is a hole saw, which I couldn't find for the last video, but I just found it sitting out in the open because that's how life goes. If this is the kind of saw that you bought to make your mold, you can also use it here, and you can also use it again when you go to shape your board. It's not going to be the most efficient for any of those things, but you can use it for all of them, and it by far costs the least. So if you're looking to save money, this is the saw you want to get. However, if you want to have an easier time, get a normal handsaw. Or if you have one, again, use what you have. And then the last tool that you're going to need is a straight edge, some kind. Square is a little bit easier to use than a ruler, but there's a better chance that you already have a ruler sitting around. So use what you have. And it also costs a little more. So again, if you're on a budget, just buy what you can afford. If you've got a square, or if you can afford a square, it's a really lovely tool to have. and I recommend picking one up. So, tools, materials, let's get started on this build. I'll show you how to make some of these clamps. So I know I want these clamps to be compatible with the set that I've already made. So I'm going to be taking my measurements from the existing set. I've got one of my spars here. I get the length of it. Looks to be about 12.25. I'm going to use that to mark the length on my new spar. And this is the place where the square comes in handy, just because you can use it to get a nice square line to your board. It's not super important in this case, but it's a really nice tool. I like having them. And then we're going to use that handsaw to just cut this off. Oop. Sorry about that. So now we've got our pair, and you're just going to want to cut as many of these as you need for however many clamps you're going to make, 2 per clamp. For demonstration purposes, I'm going to go quickly cut one more of these, and we'll do the whole clamp from scratch so that you can see how laying out the holes and everything works. So I actually ended up cutting a couple extra spars. This is the first spar I made from the original set, where I marked out my center line and my drill holes. We're going to do the same thing on these new spars that I did here. I have the extra consideration where I'd like very much for my new clamps to work interchangeably with my old clamps, so I'm going to try to get them as close as possible. It's a little bit less precise if you're making your set from scratch all at once, but the first thing that we need to do is find the center line of our spar. And one of the reasons I like a combination square in general, and for this, is that it's very easy to find a center without doing a lot of math. So what you do is you take a measurement of the width of your board, of the width of the thing you're trying to find a center. This is 3.5 inches and just a smidge. So we'll go to 1 3/4 for half. But we also have to take into account that this isn't going to be quite perfect, and also the width of our line that we mark with is going to push away from the end of our ruler a little bit. So this is the trick. You take your half measurement from one side and you mark a line. You flip the square over and do the same with the same measurement. You mark a line on the other side, and then you can see that there's a small gap between the two. And right, that looks to be about 1/16 of an inch. You don't have to be precise about it, but you want to just take your square and compensate for that gap. So I'm just going to take a smidge of width off of that initial measurement, and then you repeat what you just did by making a mark from both sides. Make a mark from this side. And if it's exactly center, those two marks should now overlap, which they do. So that is bang on center for what we need. I'm just going to mark the center line in from the edge a little bit, because we're only going to drill about there, and do the same thing on this side. And then you want to take a width in from the sides of your spars that just leaves enough material on the outside so that you don't have to worry about the bolts busting out. Now I actually have to try to match this to my existing set, so I'm just going to take a quick measurement here. Looks like I was aiming originally for 1 1/4. Put this side. Yeah, that's about right. I'll get into this a little bit more later, but it's good to have some wiggle room, so we're going to over drill these. So even if the spars and the bolts don't line up perfectly, there's enough room so the pieces can move around to be able to do what they need to do. And it also means that you don't have to be super precise when you're doing your layup, and you can kind of just smack stuff together, which you want because a layup is time sensitive. So I've got my measurement. I'm just going to measure in from the edges. And these are our drill points. So let's grab the drill. So next we're going to drill through our spars so that we have a place to sink our bolts down through our clamps. I just mentioned this little consideration, but it can be really useful in this case to oversize your holes. You can see that this bit is quite a bit wider than the bolt. And it means the bolt's going to wiggle around, but it means that you're going to be able to get everything lined up more easily and more quickly when you need to. And this is still narrow enough that the head of the bolt will have plenty of surface area to push against when we're clamping. It also makes it a little bit easier to get this square end of these carriage bolts into the holes. So just go a little bit wider than you'd need for a snug fit when you're picking your bit. Oh yeah. Let's just drill the other side. And at this point, you're done. And you can take the spar that you've just made, instead of having to go through and mark all the spars that you've cut, if you're making a set, you use this as a template to drill out your next one. Now I just want to check real quick to make sure that these are going to be compatible. So, great, everything lines up, so those will work together just fine. So let's take one of our existing spars and use it as a template to drill out our new ones. So that marks that side. That marks that side. Now we've got really clear indications of where we need to drill so that everything works together. If you're using the spars that you've made as a template, don't do them sequentially. So don't make one, use it as the template for the next one, use that for the template for the next one. Make sure that you're always using the same spar as the template. That's going to give you the best chance of all of the pieces working together. Because if there's any mistakes in the spars that you make from the first one, they'll compound as you move through the whole set. So you got one left to do. Let's get it marked, get it drilled. So that gives us 2 sets of spars, which will make us 2 clamps. You make as many of these as you need for the size of the mold that you have, for the size of the boards that you want to make. And I'll show you how the clamps go together. Could not be simpler. It's going to take about 3 seconds. So as I mentioned earlier, for each clamp you're going to need 2 bolts, 2 washers, and 2 nuts. And assembly couldn't be easier. All you're doing is taking your bottom spar, inserting 2 of the bolts through the spar, putting your top spar over it, dropping the washers in place, that was cool, and then putting your nuts on. And actually, the way I prefer to do a layup, the spar, the washer, and the nuts come after you've done the whole layup, but there's plenty of room there to kind of treat it and make it your own. A couple of notes while I've got the clamp in front of me. You want to make sure that when you get your carriage bolts, that they're long enough to have the height of both of your spars and also the height of your mold, plus a little bit, because there's going to be some extra room in the mold before you start squeezing it down and compressing the 2 halves so they meet together. So make sure that you've got enough play this way. And the other thing that I want to show you is the reason we oversize the holes is so that it's really easy to get everything to line up. If these were snug, tight holes that the bolts were going through, it would be very tough to be able to just slap the top spar on top of it and get it down into place really quickly. So let me show you how they work. So this is how I like to go about using these clamps. I've got the bottom halves of my new set of 4 clamps laid out. I'm going to take the bottom half of the mold that we made in the last video. I'm going to get these placed in the places that I think are important to have the most force. So I want to make sure I've got some clamping down the transition from the nose to the concave. I want to make sure that I've got one clamping down on the tail to make sure the tail is nice and compressed. And since I don't have one over this piece of concave here, and the transition between it and the tail, I'm going to make sure this one is pretty close to it. And then, actually, I think this one is pretty good where it is. Once you've got them placed, this is the point at which you would do your layup and then proceed to press your deck. We're going to spend a whole video getting into the details about how that works and how to do it quickly and how to do it efficiently, what you need to prepare beforehand, and things like that. But the quick version of it is your board and glue go in here. The top half of your mold goes in place. You drop down your top spars. Add your washers. Nuts. All you need to do in order to press your board is just tighten these nuts as much as possible, and all of that force, and it's a surprising amount of force that you can get out of a screw, all of that force will be transferred across the spars, down through the mold, and into your veneers and into your plies so that you can press a deck. Now, there's one more thing that I want to show you about making boards this way, is that it's really easy to take this and make it into this. This is the press that I used to make most of the boards from the Cheapskates Dozen, that art show that I did over the summer, and one of the mold sets from that set of boards. The only difference between this press and the sets of clamps that we just made is that the bottom spars are all just attached to the bottom of the press with some glue. And you can see I've got an extra spar here in the middle to make 5 in case I decide I need some extra clamping pressure. And all this is a poplar board that's been glued on top of those bottom spars. You could use pine, you could use whatever is available as long as it's wide enough for you to get your molds into. And one of the advantages, in addition to the low cost and ease of use of a press like this, and the reason that I use this press instead of my big electric press, is that this can be packed up. It's lightweight and you can take it with you wherever you go. I was moving around a lot when I was making the boards for that show, and the ability to pack this press into a car and take it wherever I needed to be and be able to press boards was the only way I made it through making all the boards that I needed for that show. So a really good advantage to have, really good tool to have in your toolkit as a board maker, even if you've got a more powerful press, because this one you can take with you. It doesn't cost a whole lot extra in materials to add this kind of bottom board, making your clamps into a single press, into like a rack. And in addition to being able to pick them all up easier and move them around, it adds a little bit of rigidity. If you get into longer molds, especially something that has a rocker, this stiff board on the bottom will make sure that your molds stay flat and that you actually get something closer to the shape that's in your molds than you would if you just had free-floating clamps. However, the clamps that we just made work great. And I will show you how in the next video, which is going to be all about material selection for the molds and style of press that we made, cutting your stock, glue selection, laying out and gluing up your decks, and doing the actual pressing. And we're going to do that 2 ways for demonstration. We're going to use the clamps we just made, and also just for proof of concept, I am going to do one in one of my other sets of molds by just putting a bunch of heavy stuff on top of it to show that that's a viable way of doing it as well. So I hope that you are enjoying this. I hope that you're finding this information useful. I hope that it's inspiring you to maybe go out, spend a couple bucks, make your own mold set, make your own press, and then start pressing skateboards. Because I'm telling you, there's nothing better than riding hardware that you made yourself. So my hope is that you will take this information, join me in building boards, and get out there and ride. So with that said, until next time, I'll see you soon. So, until next time. That's solely not going to reach the camera. And 2 washers that fit the carriage bolts. That's 3. I can count to 2. That's 2. So now we've got our pair, and you're just, geez man, too much caffeine.